Plant FAQs. Algerian ivy. Does Algerian ivy climb? Absolutely. Algerian ivy is a champion climber. I planted mine next to a trellis a few years ago, and it's practically devoured it. Now it's happily snaking its way up the side of my house. Algerian ivy versus English ivy. Algerian ivy brings a lush, sprawling charm to indoor spaces, but English ivy's delicate, trailing vines have a timeless elegance that adds a classic touch to any room. How fast does Algerian ivy grow? Let me tell you, this stuff grows like crazy. I swear I can practically see it reaching for the sky some days. I trim it back a couple times a year to keep it in check, but it bounces back in no time. How to care for Algerian ivy. Algerian ivy is a pretty low-maintenance plant in my experience. I water it deeply whenever the soil feels dry to the touch, and that seems to keep it happy. I haven't fertilized it much, and it's still thriving. How to get rid of Algerian ivy. Getting rid of Algerian ivy, on the other hand, can be a whole other story. I planted some in another part of my yard to create a ground cover, but it got a little too enthusiastic. Eradicating it completely took some persistence, lots of digging and pulling. How to propagate Algerian ivy. Propagating Algerian ivy is a breeze, though. I've just snipped off stem cuttings with a few leaves and popped them in water. They root pretty quickly, and then I can pot them up or plant them in the ground. Is Algerian ivy poisonous to cats? Now, here's the thing to remember. Algerian ivy is toxic to cats. Since my feline friend likes to munch on leaves, I had to keep this plant out of his reach. Luckily, it looks great hanging baskets so I can enjoy it safely. Are Algerian ivy evergreens? Absolutely. Algerian ivy definitely qualifies as an evergreen. Mine has kept its beautiful green foliage year-round, even through some chilly winters here. It adds a pop of life to my porch during the colder months when everything else seems a bit drab. Does Algerian ivy need fertilizer? While I haven't noticed a huge need for fertilizer with my Algerian ivy, I do give it a diluted dose every now and then, just to give it a little boost. It seems to appreciate the extra nutrients, especially when it's putting out a lot of new growth. How often to water Algerian ivy? As for watering, Algerian ivy can be a bit dramatic about thirst. I've learned from experience that it doesn't like to dry out completely. Letting the soil get bone dry seems to make the leaves wilt a bit. So, I try to water it before it gets to that point. How to care for Algerian ivy indoors. Indoors, Algerian ivy can thrive as long as you give it some bright, indirect light. Mine hangs out near a south-facing window, and it seems pretty happy there. Just remember, well-draining soil is key indoors to prevent root rot. How to prune Algerian ivy. Pruning Algerian ivy is a great way to keep it under control and encourage bushier growth. I usually take a pair of shears and snip off any leggy stems or trim back trailing vines to maintain the shape I want. Is Algerian ivy invasive? Be warned, Algerian ivy can be quite invasive outdoors. While it's a beautiful ground cover, it can easily take over if you're not careful. I planted some in a pot to control its spread, and that seems to work well. Is Algerian ivy poisonous for dogs? And speaking of caution, yes, Algerian ivy is unfortunately poisonous to dogs, as well as cats. So, if you have furry friends around, it's best to steer clear of this plant altogether or keep it out of reach. Is Algerian ivy woody? Algerian ivy isn't a woody vine. The stems are nice and flexible, which makes them perfect for training on a trellis or letting them cascade down from a hanging basket. What is killing my Algerian ivy? If your Algerian ivy is looking a bit worse for wear, it could be a few things. Check for signs of pests like mealybugs or spider mites. Underwatering or overwatering can also cause problems. Just adjust your watering routine and treat for any pests you find, and it should perk up again. What temp can Algerian ivy grow? Temperature-wise, Algerian ivy is a pretty adaptable plant. Mine has tolerated everything from the mild winters here to the occasional heat wave in the summer. As long as it's not exposed to freezing temperatures for long periods, it should be okay. Where can Algerian ivy grow? Algerian ivy seems to grow well in most places as long as it gets some decent light. I've seen it thriving in gardens, cascading down walls, and even happily climbing up fences. It's a versatile plant that can add a touch of green to many different spaces. Where to buy variegated Algerian ivy? Finding variegated Algerian ivy can be a bit of a challenge. Most nurseries seem to carry the standard green variety. However, I've had luck ordering one online from a specialty plant store. It was definitely worth the wait. The variegated leaves are stunning. Will Algerian ivy come back after frost? As for frost, Algerian ivy isn't a big fan. A light frost might nip the leaves a bit, but they should recover. However, a hard freeze can damage the plant. If you live in a cold climate, it's best to bring your Algerian ivy indoors before the first frost hits.